Welcome to the art of persuasive proposals. In the previous lesson, we went over the critical mistakes most of your competitors will make when writing proposals, mistakes which you are going to avoid. We also talked about leveraging influence activators to increase your value to clients and outshine your competition, and how projecting authority, regardless of your experience level, and combining it with likability, create a powerful 1-2 punch that supercharges the persuasiveness of your proposals. Now, in this lesson, we're going to go over the tested, proven approaches that I and many of my students use to write winning proposals. Okay, I'll just come right out and say it. Most of the hundreds of Upwork proposals I read each month are simply awful. One of the main reasons why is that freelancers who are writing them only know they want to be hired, but they have no clear understanding of how to accomplish that goal. So they just end up saying a bunch of stuff with no real purpose and no real direction. It reminds me of a friend of mine who was signing a lease for her first apartment after college. Her mother told her to be sure to, quote-unquote, negotiate her rent. But what the mom didn't do was give her daughter any negotiating tools. So, like 99% of renters, my friend did what felt natural. She turned to the rental agent and said, "Can you please lower the price?" And of course, predictably, the rental agent just said no. What if, instead, she'd asked for a 5% reduction in exchange for signing a 2-year lease rather than a 1-year lease? Do you see the difference? In the first scenario, my friend had no real direction and no useful tools. It was like trying to shoot a gun with no target and no bullets. Whereas in the latter scenario, she would have been operating much more strategically. Her goal would be much clearer, and she'd be using a sound approach to help her reach her target. And that is exactly how I'm going to equip you to write proposals. First off, you're going to start with a well-defined goal that's simple and doable, and that is getting a response from the client. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. As you'll recall from the previous lesson, we're not trying to close the deal on our first contact. That's too big of a commitment for the client just yet. Remember, it's better to create that decompression zone. Just like a guy doesn't message a girl on Match.com and ask her for a date straight away. His first job is just to start a conversation. Same thing here. We're just trying to open up a dialogue with the client. Another benefit that comes from this start a conversation approach is that humans have a built-in consistency mechanism, which means that once we do something, we tend to do more of it. So if we can get clients to respond favorably to our proposal, they'll tend to keep feeling favorably about us, making them more likely to want to work with us and pay us a good amount for our service. So rather than starting out with the vague and unrealistic goal of getting hired, your goal is simply to get the client to respond to your proposal. Simple, doable, and straightforward. First things first, before we can get the client to message us back, he needs to read through our entire proposal. And before he does that, we need to first make sure we capture his attention. And we have to do it quickly, right in our first sentence. Not our second sentence or our third. Our very first sentence needs to grab the client and make him want to keep reading. And you'll see why in the next slide. For now, here's the good news. You do not need to say anything brilliant, special, or dramatic in order to accomplish this. Notice that I said the goal was to ensure the client keeps reading, not move him to tears or cause him to giggle with delight. The truth is, you already have the client's attention. He's obviously interested in hearing pitches from freelancers, or he wouldn't have posted a job in the first place. So your job is to keep his attention, which is much easier than trying to get him to notice you from scratch. Think of driving. People notice radio ads much more easily than billboards because they're already listening. Still, to understand just how important the one-sentence rule really is, let's take a look at what clients see when you submit a proposal. Okay, so this is a screenshot of what your proposals look like from the client's end. As you can see, he only gets a little snippet of your proposal right up front. So the one-sentence rule isn't based on some arbitrary estimate. We can really only rely on the client seeing the first sentence or two of our proposal. If he wants to see the rest, he has to actually click on that little More button, which you can see circled in red on the screen. So we always want to write that first sentence under the assumption that if it doesn't immediately hook the client, then he isn't likely to read the rest. Again, you don't need to come up with an earth-shattering opening here. Remember, the client already has some interest in what we're saying. The job of that first line is to keep him interested and get him to click that More button. There are a million different ways you can do this, but let me show you one example that I've found to be effective on Upwork across all niches. This is what I call the affirmation approach. I call it that because it basically repeats back what the client said they were looking for in their job posting. The affirmation approach works well for several reasons. One, it's very simple and easy to execute because you don't have to make anything up, and it can be applied to almost any situation. Two, it addresses the client's needs, which makes you more likable. And three, it sets you apart from the crowd, because most freelancers won't focus on the client or their needs at all. And in fact, many won't even read through the job posting. So showing the client you understand what they're looking for in this way is effective. Put yourself into their shoes. If you saw this little snippet of text pop up in your proposal screen, are you really going to stop reading at this point? Of course not. You're probably going to click that More button and keep going. For these reasons, the affirmation approach is one of my favorites. You can feel free to spice it up using your own personality, but even in its most basic form, it will work. Let's talk about another way I sometimes get a client's attention. It's what the famous author and negotiation professor Stuart Diamond calls an emotional payment. An emotional payment is basically any statement that appeals to someone's emotions and makes them feel good. Everyone likes to be told something nice about themselves, their business, or a piece of work that they're doing. For example, I once opened a successful proposal by letting the client know that they'd done a good job with their blogging strategy. Another time, I applied to a job where the client needed editing for a recommendation letter he'd written for one of his employees. And I opened by telling him that it sounded like his employee was lucky to have him for a boss. Like the affirmation approach, emotional payments can increase your likability, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, only use them in situations where it makes sense to do so. Don't conjure up some fake reason to compliment the client just for its own sake. For example, never give a weak emotional payment like telling the client that their job description was thorough. That's just phony. Clients will pick up on that and it will backfire, making you less likable. Second, don't lay it on too thick. Just be natural. Keep it short, sweet, and sincere, and you'll be fine. Okay, here's another effective method for capturing a client's attention quickly on Upwork, and that is using a testimonial from a previous client. Now, this is a slightly more advanced approach, so if you don't have any testimonials yet, don't worry. You do not need to do this. Still, testimonials are very powerful because they offer clients social proof, which is another one of those automatic influence activators we've been talking about. If you do decide to open your proposal with a testimonial, there are a couple of guidelines you'll want to follow. First, stick to just one testimonial. Remember that your proposal is a preview for the client of what it's like to work with you, So you want it to feel simple, light, and easy to digest. Also, you should include a very brief story that explains the testimonial. For example, you can give a quick description of the client, the type of work you did for them, and what the work was meant to accomplish. Finally, keep in mind that this tactic works best when you can show the client some relevance between the testimonial and the work he needs done. For example, if the client needs web design, it's ideal if you can let him know the testimonial came from a web design client as well. Here's a good example of this tactic in action inside a real winning proposal. Again, notice how it's not just an empty testimonial, but there's a little one-sentence story to go with it that helps make it relevant to the client. Keep in mind that the client doesn't care about us, but he does care about how we can help him get what he wants. By the way, I don't want you to think about any of these tactics as rigid rules. For example, you may decide to try all of these, or you may just stick with one or two. You may use them just as I've described, or you might adapt them to your own style. You might even find it useful to combine a couple of the tactics I've given you, or you may come up with your own approaches entirely. The important thing is that you hold the client's attention. How you choose to do it will depend on things like your personality, your experience level, the individual job you're applying for, and more. So feel free to get creative with this and use any approach that makes sense for the individual situation you happen to be in. Just ask yourself if your opening line effectively captures the client's attention. If it does, then you're good to go. All right, at this point, you've overcome the first hurdle of your proposal by securing the client's attention using the one-sentence rule. Next, it's time to demonstrate your authority, and I want you to do this without wasting any time. You'll recall from the previous lesson that one of the best ways to position yourself as an authority is by showing the client an example of your work. The reason that samples work so well is that they show clients you're capable of doing their job, rather than just telling them. Remember that this doesn't have to be a creative sample, like writing or design. Depending on your niche, it can be anything, like a case study, a spreadsheet, a business or marketing plan, a screenshot of something you've accomplished, like a Google Analytics screenshot where you've successfully increased the number of monthly visitors to a blog, or literally anything else. Samples are another area that's limited only by your imagination. So if you're not a writer or designer, then feel free to think outside the box and ask yourself how you can show a client your authority rather than telling them about it. But don't rest on your laurels just because you have a high-quality work sample. You still need to overcome two hurdles. One of those hurdles is simply getting the client to look at your sample. Remember, clients will be hearing from lots of freelancers, and they can easily wind up with dozens of work samples piled up for their review. There's no way they can look at all of these. The good news is that it isn't that difficult to get clients to look at your work samples once you understand and use the approaches I'm teaching you. But for now, it's important that you do not assume that the client will look at your sample just because. We need to give them reasons to do it. And even that is not enough. We don't just want the client to go through the motions of looking at your sample. We want to get them excited about it. If that sounds impossible, it's not. Think back to the last time you were hungry. Could I have gotten you excited with a pizza? Of course I could have. Well, clients are hungry too. They're hungry for whatever service they're in the market for. My clients are hungry for good copywriting, so I can get them excited with good copywriting just like I can get you excited with a pizza. But, like all great pizza restaurants know, the key lies in how we present our product. So there are 3 rules I want you to follow for presenting your samples to clients. Okay, so the first rule of getting the client to look at your sample is that I want you to be a curator. And by that, I mean I want you to choose which sample to show the client. You should never give a client aimless instructions, like telling them to go look at your portfolio in order to see your work. Remember that this is their first glimpse into what it's like to work with you. So make their life easy. Do the work for them. Pick out a small number of samples to show them. Ideally, you'd pick just one that's most relevant to what they need. Choosing the sample for them shows them that you're someone who's easy to work with. It also allows you to choose the most appropriate sample versus sending the client to your portfolio and hoping they look at the right ones. Being a curator also makes it much more likely that the client will look at your sample to begin with. When you think about it, it's very easy for them to psychologically commit to looking at a single sample that you're directing them to, rather than having to sort through your portfolio or website, which is mentally draining to them. Also keep in mind that you should never send the client more than 3 samples. Again, you want to make their life easy and keep this process simple. Okay, on Upwork, attaching a file to your proposal is not ideal. There's no immediate way for the client to know there's an attachment to look for, so it's easy for them not to notice. Fortunately, there are 2 other effective options you can use. Let's talk about my favorite one first. If you're a writer and your writing sample is relatively short, then the best way to show it to the client is actually to copy and paste it right into the proposal itself. You can also do this with a short case study. The copy and paste approach makes it extremely easy for the client to read, since all they have to do is move their eyes down the page. One word of caution: if you use this approach, make sure to put an extra space between each paragraph of your writing, because otherwise it won't format properly. And keep in mind that this approach works best for relatively short writing pieces only. For all other samples, you can simply upload them to your Upwork portfolio and then include a link for the client right in your proposal. Just remember to choose a specific sample to link the client to, rather than just sending them to your general portfolio. You can also link clients to Google Docs, screenshots, slideshows, or anything else. The options are unlimited. Okay, I want you to think back to being hungry. Imagine if I lived next door to you, and I said, "Come to my house and I'll give you food." Your response would probably be, "Meh." Think about that. I offer you a logical cure to your hunger, and you snub me. Remember, people don't make decisions based on logic. What if, instead, I told you that I just pulled a piping hot pepperoni pizza out of the oven, and there's a big slice sitting on the table with your name on it? At that point, your mouth would be watering, and you'd probably run over to my house. Notice that nothing changed, other than the way I framed the solution. That's the power of framing. Your samples work the same way. If you just send a client a link and tell them to look, their response will also be, "Meh." But if you frame your sample properly by letting the client know why it's relevant to them and their needs, you can elicit a sense of excitement that makes it more likely they'll look, more likely they'll hire you, and even more likely that they'll pay you the amount you want. Here's a simple example of this in action. Notice that I'm not just telling the client that there is a sample of my work included, I'm also telling them what it is and why it matters to them. As you can also see, just like the other approaches we've gone over, nothing fancy is required here. I'm just zeroing in on the client's need. In this case, they're hungry for a freelancer to write a video script for their college, and I'm framing my sample around that need. Once I've done that, it's almost impossible for them not to be eager to check it out. Next, let's talk about how you can use your proposal itself to demonstrate authority to the client. You can do this to augment your samples, or you can use it in any situation where your sample may not be a perfect fit for what the client is looking for, but you want to apply anyway. And as usual, you don't need to be a world-class expert in order to pull this off. Let's take a look at an example of how I was able to project rock-solid authority right in my proposal, even though I was far from the most experienced or most educated freelancer applying for the job. The job post was from a company that was, quote, looking for a blogger to create weekly business-to-business content to keep our SEO ranking high, generate leads, keep our audience engaged, and increase readership. The full posting included a brief description of the company, including their website. Unfortunately, I didn't have any portfolio samples that were very relevant to them. I actually only had one single B2B blog post I'd written in over 2 years, and it was from a totally different industry. Blog writing just isn't an area that I'd focused on. Plus, I'd written that sample about 1.5 years earlier. For all these reasons, I wasn't at all confident that the sample would convey enough authority to help me stand apart from the competition. At least, not on its own. So I knew that in order to get hired for this job, I needed to use my proposal to help me close that authority gap. Let's take a look at how I did that. Okay, so in this case, as you can see, I took a look at their website and came up with a good nugget of wisdom that I knew would position me as an authority on blogging. I could have done this in any number of ways, but the takeaway here is that I was able to nail this proposal in large part because I was able to show the client that I knew what I was talking about. Think about it from their perspective. They received a bunch of proposals and samples from other writers, but how many of them went out of their way to project authority in this way? Chances are, none. They either aren't aware of the basics of keyword research, even though it's easy to learn about all of that for free online, or they just didn't talk about it in their proposal because they don't understand the psychology of how to persuade clients. So if you're the client here, something like this is going to make you stand up and take notice. It's going to immediately set me head and shoulders above the pack. It's going to make you want to pursue me rather than the other way around. By the way, if you think it took me a long time to learn about the keyword stuff that I told the client in this proposal, it didn't. In fact, I learned most of it by reading free ebooks from copyblogger.com. Again, nothing fancy is required. This approach helped me get hired by this client at $125 per hour, which was over 2.5 times the next highest bid. Remember, as I said in the previous lesson, you don't need to be a world-class expert in order to be an authority. You just need to know more than the client. And this often doesn't take nearly as much knowledge as most people would probably think, especially since even the other freelancers who have this knowledge probably don't go out of their way to convey it to the client. They're likely to say something like, I know a lot about keywords, instead of showing the client that they know a lot about keywords. Contrast that with my approach, and it isn't hard to see why I closed this deal without any friction whatsoever. By the way, this client ended up being worth hundreds of dollars per week to me, thousands and thousands of dollars per year. So you don't need to impress many clients like this in order to do very well. Okay, let's look at another example. This one is from a brand new freelancer who used her proposal to convey authority in an even simpler way. Check out the bolded text on the screen. In this case, all the freelancer knew was that the company was looking for an About Us page for their website, and she had a very limited amount of experience in writing these. In fact, this was going to be her first Upwork client ever. But she'd done a bit of homework on what makes for a successful About Us page, and she shared that small amount of knowledge with the client in order to boost her authority along with the sample that she sent him. And guess what? It worked out beautifully. She ended up winning this job as the highest bidder. By the way, if you are someone who has relevant experience, qualifications, or credentials, feel free to bullet point these in your proposal in order to demonstrate authority. These days, as a more experienced freelancer, I sometimes do this with one of my published articles, the fact that I'm a Copyblogger certified content marketer, or even my own blog. Another option is to use a testimonial, just like we discussed earlier when we talked about the one-sentence rule. Imagine I post a job looking for a freelancer to edit this video you're watching right now. Let's say I get 10 proposals, all from freelancers telling me how amazing they are. Totally unimpressive. But then the 11th one tells me that he recently edited an online course for one of his clients. And then he drops in a really positive testimonial from that client. That would not only get my attention, it would also be a powerful way for him to show me his authority. But please remember that you don't need any of this. I was a successful freelancer for years before I ever tried any of these approaches. And even today, I hardly ever use them. Regardless of where you're at, use what you do have, and the rest will come in time. All right, by this point, you've successfully captured the client's attention, you've demonstrated your authority by showing it to the client rather than merely telling them about it, and you've done all of this in a way that makes you appear like someone who's likable and easy to work with. Now, there's just one more step needed to make your proposal truly effective and persuasive, and that is prompting the client to respond. The good news is that if you've done your job well, this part won't be very difficult. The client should want to contact you back. Still, you can help light a fire under their ass even further, and there are a couple of effective methods for doing that. Let's go over them now. One option is to ask the client a question about their project. What you're trying to do here is trigger the natural reflex we all have to respond to questions. For example, if you ask a stranger on the street for the time, they'll almost always reply. For best results, you need to ask a question that's very easy for the client to answer quickly. Otherwise, they'll put off responding or just ignore you completely. For that reason, you also need to be specific rather than vague. For example, asking what type of product a client sells is a good question because it's specific and they can answer you in 2 seconds without even thinking. On the other hand, if you simply ask for more details about their project, that's vague and they'll have to think about what to say, in which case you probably won't end up hearing back from them. Along these same lines, you should ask as few questions as possible. Preferably, too many is a surefire way to get ignored. Another call to action that works well with Upwork proposals is asking clients if they're available for a Skype chat to discuss their project in more detail. The key here is, as always, to make it simple and easy for the client to say yes. Suggest a short voice call. For example, 5 minutes. This is low pressure, and it's an amount of time that's easy for even a busy person to commit to. Perhaps more importantly, it shows the client that you're someone who understands how to work with busy people, and that you respect their time. Even when clients don't take you up on the call, you still increase your likability just because you offered, and because you framed your offer in a way that shows them you're easy to work with. So this approach has a double benefit. If you do end up Skyping with the client, then you increase your chances of getting hired. And even if you don't, they'll appreciate the gesture and the way that you presented it, making you come across as professional, courteous, and likable. Remember, high-quality clients are busy, and they look for freelancers who are easy to work with and who respect their time. Okay, let's do a 60-second summary of what we've learned here. Your proposal needs to accomplish 4 things. 1. Capture the client's attention. 2. Prove that you're easy to work with. 3. Demonstrate your ability. And 4. Get the client to message you back. I want you to think of each proposal like a train on a track. You're trying to get from the train station, a blank proposal, to your final destination, which is the client responding. When you point to any given sentence within your proposal, that sentence is either keeping you on the track and helping you reach your goal, or it's veering you away from the track. And the framework you see on your screen right now will help you determine which. For example, many average proposals contain a sentence that sounds like this: I believe I'd be a good fit for your project. Most freelancers wouldn't think twice about this sentence. But notice that, as a client, it doesn't capture my attention, it doesn't make me like you, it doesn't show me you can do my job, and it doesn't make me want to message you back. So we can see that a sentence that most freelancers would find acceptable is really a complete waste of time and space. In fact, when you evaluate it against this framework, you can see that it's actually working against you, veering you away from the track. That may sound harsh, but I'm here to teach you how to win. Okay, now before we get to the action steps for this lesson, I want to make one thing very clear. I do not want you to get hung up on the individual tactics we've covered. Yes, these tactics do work, but more important than the tactics themselves are the strategies behind the tactics. If you just start applying the tactics randomly, without rhyme or reason, then you're more likely to end up with a big mishmash of words rather than a cohesive, persuasive proposal. On the other hand, by focusing on what you're trying to accomplish with each sentence of your proposal, you'll be able to write a persuasive pitch regardless of which individual tactics you happen to choose. And you're free to use any tactics at all that accomplish those goals. For example, does it matter if you start off your proposal with the affirmation approach or something funny that you think the client will love hearing? Of course not. All that matters is that you capture their attention. The how isn't nearly as important. And this is true for projecting authority, likability, and enticing the client to message you back. Feel free to try out any approaches you think might work, and that includes adapting the tactics I've shown you to fit your own personality and style. Here are your action steps. First, download the Persuasive Proposal Checklist I've included with this lesson. Print it out and put it on your desk or hang it on a nearby wall. Next, I want you to start writing proposals using the guidelines and psychology I've laid out. With each proposal, check it over using the checklist, then send it off. If you're new to writing proposals, feel free to ease into it. But I'd like you to aim to send out at least one proposal in the next 24 hours. If you're more experienced, then a better goal would be to send out at least 2 to 3 in the next day. Remember that your ultimate goal is to get repeat business from your clients. Meanwhile, the more persuasive proposals you send, the quicker you'll reach that goal. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.